In the spirit of time and making sure that you get a chance to hear from our wonderful presenters, I'm going to get us started. My name is Sarah Arden. I work for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and really my job today is just to introduce and get us started. So we can move on to the next slide. You're going to hear from two of our really excellent speakers today, Dr. Kim St. Martin and Dr. Sharon Vaughn. Kim St. Martin from the Michigan MTSS TA Center, who I know many of you probably know, but who does some really excellent work. And then Sharon Vaughn, Dr. Sharon Vaughn from the Meadow Center at the University of Texas at Austin are here. They're going to talk about this really excellent resource about intensifying instruction and literacy and some great practices today. They're the authors on this document, and really just such an excellent resource. We're so fortunate to have their expertise. So before I pass it over to them to sort of talk through this resource today, just some sort of format and questions for the webinar. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions for us or for the presenters, please submit them into the chat. If you've got technical questions, one of our webinar team members, so that's myself, Amy Peterson, Lauren Rosenbauer, we will try to assist you as soon as possible. We are going to try to address some content related questions as well. I know some of you have submitted some questions when you registered for the webinar. We have gone through those questions, and so we're going to try to get to some of those as best we can during the webinar. We're going to try to get to some questions as we go through. We're going to try to get to some questions at the end. As Sharon said, we're really eager to hear from you, so please submit your questions. We'll do our best to answer those as we go through. And so, feel free to chime in as needed, and as you have questions, we're eager to hear from you. That being said, that's all I have to say. I really want to pass it over to Kim and Sharon to sort of get to the point here. So I will pass it along and let Kim get started.
Well, welcome everyone. It's such a gift to be with everyone today. I wanted to just give a quick shout out to our other colleagues who are not on this call, but who were instrumental in helping to shape the contents of the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Essential Practices Guide. Gary Troya, Hank Feen, and Michael Coyne were all a part of this work. So a huge kudos and a level of gratitude for the work that they actually did in helping to shape this guide. If you haven't already accessed the document, you can do so by visiting NCII's website. I did, for those of you who have access to the PowerPoint, I did include the link to this document. For my Michigan colleagues, it is also available on the My MTSS Technical Assistance Center's website. All right, so before we dig in, we want to take a moment to get to know who's here today and the different roles that you serve in supporting leaders and educators and students. So I think Sarah and Amy, you guys are going to release the poll, yes? So take a minute and identify the primary role that you serve. And we're close to getting everyone, so got about a couple more. Okay, there we go. We're gonna share the results now. All right, so let's take a look at who we have. So we have a mix of people, which is wonderful. I see we've got primarily other. I'm wondering what other is. Feel free to add that into the chat box. We have some state level folks, some regional education agency folks, ISD, BOCES, AEA, ancillary staff, some elementary administrators, central office. So look at this mix. This is fabulous. All right, so that's given us a chance to see who's here today. The contents of the Intensifying Guide really serve as the foundation for establishing policy, allocating resources, and providing professional learning to support a broad range of learners who have literacy difficulties, including, but certainly not limited to, students with disabilities. The 5 practices in the Intensifying Guide are identified as targeted to leaders, so district administrators, school administrators, or teachers, general educators, special educators, and certainly interventionists. Within an MTSS framework, the information within the guide would be categorized as Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. However, it is very important to remember that most students who receive Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports spend majority of their time in the classroom or core subject area setting in Tier 1. So the contents within the guide are applicable across all tiers, Tiers 1, 2, and 3. We cannot forget the importance of high quality Tier 1 class-wide instruction and the quality of the curriculum resources that we are putting into the hands of educators as they are working to develop skillful readers and writers. We will not ever be able to intervene our way out of a core class-wide Tier 1 curriculum issue. So we cannot forget the importance of that. We also have to meaningfully be able to distinguish the level of intensity for Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention supports. And we believe that this guide begins to do that. It really begins to identify what the most intensive level of intervention, Tier 3, can and should look like as we are adapting and individualizing, intensifying the intervention instruction. We must use data to make decisions around students' response to the intervention instruction. The term literacy is really broadly framing the contents of the guide, and it's commonly used in education. It's important, though, for people to keep in mind that reading and writing are their own distinct but interconnected set of skills. They are two unique skill clusters, so each is recognized as a very valuable component to teachers' instruction. Our goal, though, is to integrate the ways in which we're teaching reading and writing. There are 5 essential practices within this guide. The first one being knowledge and use of a learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers, designing and using an evidence-based intervention platform, the third, ongoing data-based decision-making for providing and intensifying intervention, adaptations to increase the instructional intensity of the intervention, and last but not least, infrastructures or systems to support students that have significant, severe, persistent needs. For the context of our webinar today, since it is an overview and we only have an hour together, Sharon and I are going to touch on 3 of these essential practices. We're going to focus on practices 1, 2, and 4. I do want to give a nod, though, to systems, because some people may say, well, systems is the 5th practice. And so is it the least in terms of importance? And the answer is no. Systems, we have to admit, systems are not necessarily viewed as sexy and glamorous. For those of you who are PBIS colleagues, I know Dale Cusimano, you're on this call, so you know Dr. Rob Horner very well. I remember being in a presentation where Rob said, systems aren't viewed as sexy. I love the quote, though, by Seymour Sarenson: place a good person and a bad system, and the system will win every time. And that is true. We should not ignore the systems to support educators in being able to use the curriculum resources and to support the students. MTSS is the system. It is the framework that nests the evidence-based practices, programs, and assessments, and the procedures for how we're going to use these things well. The systems may not be viewed as sexy or glamorous. At the same time, if we don't focus on systems, in their absence, implementation and outcomes are going to suffer. So don't be fooled. Just because systems is essential practice 5 does not mean that it's the least in terms of importance. So let's dig into essential practice 1, knowledge and use of a learning progression for developing skilled readers and writers. We have framed the learning progressions for reading in this case around the simple view of reading. Many of you may be very familiar with the simple view of reading. It is a multiplicative explanation for how to develop skillful reading, skillful understanding or comprehension of what was read. And word recognition, decoding, students' ability to read words accurately and quickly, multiplied by language comprehension, students' ability to extract and construct meaning from spoken language equals reading comprehension, students' ability to extract and construct meaning from text. So the simple view of reading has really framed the learning progression that Sharon and I have outlined, Sharon and I and our other colleagues have outlined in developing skilled readers. At the same time, when we think about the simple view of reading from a beginning reader's perspective, I borrowed this slide from Mark Seidenberg and Mark's postdoctoral student, Molly Barker-Ferry-Thorne. And Mark and Molly actually took the components from the simple view of reading from that multiplicative explanation, and they framed it around what students come to school having. So in this case, students have knowledge from spoken language. They come with vocabulary, grammar, and knowledge of the world. Now, their vocabulary and knowledge of the world may not be the same as all of the students, but students come to school, children come to school having knowledge of spoken language. They must learn how print represents sound in order to read. And so what we've done in the learning progression for developing skilled readers is try to hone in on what it is that students need to be intentionally, explicitly taught in order to be skillful readers. Sharon, before I go into the learning progression, what would you add based on some of the stuff we just talked about?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. A couple of things that I like to say is that there's nothing simple about the simple view of reading. It's actually very complex. What's simple about it is that there aren't as many constructs. So by a construct, when we talk about decoding or we talk about linguistic or language comprehension, those are the big constructs, but those are umbrellas. And under those umbrellas are a lot of components. And so I think it's really important that it's not degrading to use the simple view of reading. Some people think, oh my gosh, that's kind of makes literacy seem easy and doesn't take into account all of the complexities and issues related to acquiring literacy. No, that's not true. It's just that these constructs are mega constructs under which many components reside, such that the understanding of literacy is made clear and applicable, so we know what to do.
Thanks, Sharon. Absolutely. And this is when Sharon and our colleagues really started fleshing out the learning progression. These are estimates regarding when certain skills are introduced, when formal instruction would taper off or end. The way in which the learning progressions are structured is you have a table, and up at the top of that table, you see the progression, starting with novice reader, moving all the way through 12th grade is skillful, like a skilled reader. You see each bar is outlined, and they're broken up into both of the components of the simple view of reading, the word recognition or decoding components and the language comprehension components. You see on some bars, there is a tail that's attached to the tip of the triangle, it looks like that. And what that represents is ongoing use, skill refinement, and transfer of those skills to new contexts. So I always give this example. I'm a mother of 3 boys, and 2 of my 3 boys, when they were younger, they had an obsession with dinosaurs. And so they wanted me to read for bedtime the Dinosaur Encyclopedia. Now, this is a good example of how my advanced decoding skills were still put to use, even as an adult, because I had to practice, almost do a pre-read of the section of the Dinosaur Encyclopedia so I could figure out how to pronounce the names of these dinosaurs. It was a good reminder to me of what students must feel like when they're reading aloud or put in situations where they're reading, where they may not know how to accurately, confidently pronounce all of the words. So that's always my example of a real human experience of, I still use my advanced decoding skills in this case, in the context of dinosaurs. I did take those Scarborough's reading rope, the tail end of Scarborough's reading rope, to just remind everyone that we are teaching these things, and these components very much can be and should be woven together braided together to be able to develop skilled reading. And we cannot forget the importance of the fact that we are teaching these things for the purpose of developing students to be good readers. Sharon, what were you going to add? You look like you were going to add something.
I just wanted to say that, I think it's important to understand that this multiplicative view of reading is kind of important. It's not additive. And what that means is that as children develop, and that's why this developmental sequence is important, the foundation skills, the more decoding side, is really much more important in terms of yielding comprehension. And then as students move beyond like second grade, and of course, all along, we want to be developing and building linguistic comprehension. But in terms of its contribution to improving comprehension, it accelerates or becomes a more impactful component as students get older. So anyway, that's probably why this developmental sequence makes so much sense to me.
Although we're not going to have time to go into the learning progression for writing, we did want to give a nod to the fact that the writing learning progression is framed around the simple view of writing. It too is a multiplicative explanation for skilled written expression. And we have transcription skills multiplied by translation skills equals skilled written expression. And so the same information that Sharon just shared about the fact that if one of these components is absent, then our ability to truly have skilled written expression is significantly compromised. And so you will find on page 12 of the Intensifying Guide, you'll find more information about the writing progression. Here are some of the takeaways that we want to leave you with regarding the learning progressions. Developing skillful readers and writers, it requires instruction in specific skills that need to be carefully sequenced and are built upon throughout students' educational careers. The things that need to be taught can be organized by the components within the simple view of reading and the simple view of writing. If we have educators, whether it's classroom teachers, special educators, interventionists, who are uncertain about how learning to read and learning to write develop and how best to teach those things, their ability to intervene in a way that is designed to accelerate outcomes is significantly limited. This is why the knowledge and use of a learning progression is the first essential practice in this guide. Without understanding how reading and writing develop, intervention supports would almost feel like shadow boxing. So I think it's very important that we make sure that educators have good foundational knowledge about how to develop skilled readers and writers. So we have our second poll, and we want to take a moment to give you a chance to reflect on people's understanding of the simple view of reading and the reading learning progression. So we just released the poll. Take a few minutes and fill out some of the questions or answer some of the questions. There's only 4. And you see some of the things in these questions are getting at some of the understandings of MTSS, which is very good for information for us to have. I was just doing a couple of webinars a few weeks ago, and there are a lot of folks who say, gosh, we only have 2 tiers or we have 6 tiers. I think I was with one group that did say they had as many as 6 or 7 tiers. And so this is good information because it's frankly challenging to put 3 tiers in place.
Kim, I one time did a presentation called, the number of tiers needed gives me tears. Mm-hmm. And the reason I did it is because it's not evident that how people count a tier. So every time a student needs an intervention, is that another tier? Because if you divide your interventions into 12-week segments or 20-week segments, and a student is in those 12 or 20-week segments multiple times, do you keep calling those tiers? And so I just think how we describe that might have something to do with how many tiers we think we have in our district.
I love the name of that presentation. What was it again? The Tears Bring Me to Tears?
Yeah.
Very good. So I think we've released and shared the results for everyone. So you can see that we have most of our respondents, 94%. The district's MTSS framework includes 3 tiers, and tier 3 does also support students with disabilities. The intervention and curriculum resources that are used for tier 2 are programs with documented evidence. We have about 60%, and some that are saying no or unsure. So this is really, really good information, because when we delve into essential practice 2, which is focusing on the intervention platform, I'm gonna pull in some of the information from this poll to add some additional context to what is meant by essential practice 2. All right, so what is an intervention platform? Now, Sharon, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you have defined intervention platform for a lot of the field. One of my pre-work assignments when I do this presentation is for people to watch your NCII webinar talking about an intervention platform. Can you define an intervention platform for our participants?
Yeah, I think, let me share my initial thinking on this and see how people relate to it. So what I was thinking is that as we get interested in making interventions more intense, in other words, our students with reading difficulties are responding inadequately to even typically effective tier 1 and tier 2 interventions. We have to think of a mechanism for making those more intensive interventions as customized as possible to respond to students who have inadequately respond to what's usually effective. So when I think of a platform, I think of a collection of practices. They're not always programs, like, for example, explicit instruction is a practice. It's not a program. Now, good programs embed explicit instruction in them, but teachers need to know that practice. It's associated with improved outcomes, and it might very well be the secret sauce of improving outcomes. So that's a practice. A program is a collection, obviously, of lessons or practices that are standardized, and they have been intentionally reviewed, that is peer reviewed, and considered associated with improved outcomes for that population. So we consider that sort of the building block. And if we haven't started with these platforms, then customizing for students who aren't responsive is not a useful activity. So we must have, if you will, research-based or science-based practices in place at tier 1 and tier 2 to create this platform from which we can derive more intensive interventions for tier 3.
And when we think about the intervention platform, we are also talking about resources. These resources are not necessarily intended to be developed by individual teachers. To design effective reading and writing intervention materials requires significant expertise in the content area, for example, like reading or writing. It also requires significant expertise in instructional design principles and learning science. And in addition to that, it requires a significant amount of time, which our educators, always have been putting in well beyond 40 hours per week. I know the educators I had the gift of working with when I was an administrator were there at the crack of dawn in the school and often remained until late at night. And especially now in the midst of the pandemic and virtual schooling and all of the things that are happening, this requires a significant amount of time. So we really are not expecting these intervention curriculum resources or materials to be developed by individual teachers. So the taxonomy of intervention intensity is something that actually frames a good portion of the Intensifying Literacy Guide. The taxonomy of intervention, which you can see the information handout that I believe Sarah and Amy and others have included links to resources at the end that would give you access to this document. But this is a great document that outlines the dimensions of intervention intensity. Those are the things that are located on the left-hand side of that column of that table in the handout. And then it provides a description of each of those dimensions. And this document that you see page 1 of applies these dimensions of intervention intensity, strength, dosage, alignment, you go right down that column through the lens of academics. And then if you were to scroll down to page 2, it frames these dimensions to the context of behavior. And there are 2 ways in which you could use these dimensions of intervention intensity, or the taxonomy of intervention. The first way, which is the way we're going to talk about in the context of this practice, is to carefully review and evaluate intervention materials and practices, curriculum resources. The second way in which you can use these dimensions is to be able to look at students' data and look at their level of response to the intervention instruction and consider some of these dimensions to be able to adapt, to intensify, so that adapt and intensify the instruction in order to help accelerate student outcomes. So we're gonna focus on the dimensions right now in the context of considerations for carefully reviewing and evaluating curriculum resources. Some of those key considerations for the individuals who are identified as being responsible or charged with the review and careful evaluation, we would want individuals to think about, does the evidence suggest that the intervention is expected to lead to improved student outcomes? That would be framed around strength. Will the group size, duration, frequency provide sufficient opportunities for students to respond during the instruction? That's getting at dosage. Does the intervention match to the student's identified needs, so alignment? Does it assist the student in being able to generalize the learned skills to their classroom setting or general education setting or another context? So that's focusing on attention to transfer. Does the intervention include these elements of explicit instruction or comprehensiveness? Does the student have opportunities to develop the behavioral skills to be successful during the intervention instruction, looking at behavioral support? And last but not least, can this intervention be individualized with a data-driven process that's going to be able to address the student's needs? So that's getting at the dimension of individualization. Sharon, were you going to add something? It looks like you were about to add something.
You know, the only thing I was thinking about as I heard you describe that is I was imagining myself as a classroom teacher, and that's a mouthful to consider for each of my students. And so the way I like to think about it is that these are guiding questions that I should be thinking about as a teacher, so that I'm customizing these already existing research-based practices in ways that are responsive to students. And so if you tried to sort of set up this set of questions for every single student, I think it would be a burden that would be beyond what all, except for maybe Dale Webster and a few people, could manage. So I guess what I would ask you to also do is to think about commonalities in the students you teach. For example, you may have several students who have attention problems and also have problems with the foundation skills. And think about the ways in which these key considerations could be manifested in the way in which you adjust instruction for those students. So that was just meant to be sympathetic to the fact that going through this with every student and customizing it may not be as efficient as most of us could possibly put in place.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point to make. I know with a lot of the districts that we work with, districts as a part of their district implementation infrastructure, they have a formal review, selection, deselection process. And we have district leaders who are leveraging expertise from others. In this case, who would have literacy expertise, maybe even others from their intermediate school districts who are research junkies that could dig into studies and look at effect sizes. But we would suggest too that that these dimensions, which you're going to see in this slide, that you could actually do a review, a careful review of various intervention materials that are out there as a way to, for lack of a better term, create a potential menu of interventions that students may be able to access if they need tier 2 intervention supports or more intensive tier 3 supports. And so within some of the districts that we're working with, and I know I've worked with some other states in Ohio who also have district established review and selection processes, a tool like the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity Academic Rating Rubric, which is a mouthful, can be very much seamlessly woven into a district's process. And this is a really nice tool. Again, something that I would not be handing out to individual teachers and saying, here you go, select something and apply this rubric to it. This really is something that guides people's analysis and their review evaluation of materials in each of those dimensions of intervention intensity. And I have done some sessions where I've modeled how to do this with existing curriculum resources that are, published intervention materials. And the thing to keep in mind is that it's sometimes hard to find evidence or research studies that have been done on things. And there are some intervention programs aren't necessarily written, curriculum resources aren't written to include behavioral supports as one example. And so there are things when people go through a careful review and analysis where things come out as not, a 0 or a 1. It's not to say that you should throw it out or don't consider it. But going in, I like to use the word eyes wide open about what are some dimensions that could be right out the gate, strengthen and address, like adding behavioral supports proactively, and that would make the intervention even more robust and increase the likelihood that we're able to accelerate student outcomes. So this is something that the academic rating rubric, I would encourage people to practice. What are you, look like you're laughing, Sharon? What are you going to add?
Oh, I'm just laughing, Kim, because I posted these questions in the chat that I think are really interesting and no one responds. So it's one of them is, how do you think fidelity fits into these tier 3 interventions as we start to apply the taxonomy? Because by definition, we're making some adjustments. And I had another question about whether they think that asking teachers to customize these tier 3 instruction for the most intensive needs of students, how difficult that is. I was just laughing at it shows how esoteric it is. It's so interesting to me, and it may not be interesting to anyone else. So carry on.
I was in the middle of responding, Sharon.
Oh.
Dale.
Thanks, Dale. I appreciate it. I know I could depend on you for esoteric boutique kinds of conversations. Oh, thank you, others. I got them going now, Kim. So carry on. I'll respond in the chat room.
Well, I love the fact that you put that into the chat, because it actually is going to be something that we talk about when we delve deeper into practice 4, the adaptations to the intervention instruction. We're actually going to talk about, what does fidelity mean when we're looking at it through a tier 2 lens versus this most intensive level of tier 3 individualized intensive support. So that's a great warm up. So I'm curious, we want to hear from you. What are some of the benefits that there may be in having people use the dimensions of intervention intensity or the taxonomy to guide intervention selection and evaluation? What are some of the benefits? People might be feverishly still responding to your question, Sharon. So we've just thrown another one in. So you answered your own question?
Of
Or you're
course.
answering this question. Okay.
I talk to myself all the time. I ask and answer my own questions. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question? Because as you said, we are reading Sharon's questions, and it's really worthy if you could repeat again.
No, that's a good point. So So if we think about these dimensions of intervention intensity, so strength, dosage, et cetera, alignment, what might the benefits be in using those dimensions to guide intervention selection and evaluation? Why might that be helpful? Okay, we're getting some people in the chat. Let's see, my colleague, Melissa Nantes, may get us closer to selecting the best intervention for students based on the specific need. Taxonomy helps the teacher see how they can adapt a specific aspect of the intervention. Absolutely. Reading science is applied, thus teachers truly target and facilitate reading growth. Okay, so wonderful. So thank you so much. I'm hearing a lot of things. My colleague Dale Cusimano empowers and develops awareness and needed skills. Absolutely. So big takeaway here is that we want careful selection and evaluation of the things that we are using to deliver intervention supports, whether it's tier 2 or tier 3 supports. And there are resources out there to help guide that careful review and evaluation. The taxonomy of intervention academic rating rubric is one of those tools that can help guide your efforts. So now we're delving into practice 4. So adaptations to increase the instructional intensity of intervention. So I gave one example of an individualized intensive intervention plan. So my colleague, Megan Walsh, who actually has done some webinars in the past for NCII in the use of database individualization. Megan Walsh, who is on maternity leave, she is leading our state TA center's efforts on a model demonstration in this in intensifying literacy instruction, or the use of database individualization. So when we think about students that have the most significant severe persistent needs, we would be designing a very individualized intensive intervention plan. And I gave an example of a template that could be used to document some of those key components. In addition to the student's information, we would also want to document what's being used, what's the intervention program and practices that are being used as the platform for the most intensive tier 3 level of intervention. And there's a way in which you could document how that intervention rated for each of the dimensions using the rubric that we just outlined. And then outline some of the logistics. How's it going to be implemented? Who's going to do it? How often? What are the materials required? What are the core components of the intervention instruction? And the page 2, though, is really critical. Page 2, which is on the right-hand side of the slide, is really looking at, based on data, based on a trend of data, do we need to adapt and intensify the instruction? So we would be looking at the degree to which the student is responding to the intervention instruction. And as we're looking at the student's data, we make some careful decisions about which of the dimensions of intervention intensity we would want to adapt and strengthen. And then we would document what those adjustments are. So the fidelity, you see a row on this second page of the plan, you see a row for fidelity. Fidelity is to what is written in this plan. There are adaptations that are being made. There are instructional adjustments that are being made. We would want to make sure that the people delivering this intensive intervention instruction, like our special educators or individuals who are tasked to provide tier 3 intervention, that they're following the components of the plan, and we're supporting them to do so. And so there are a variety of resources that we're starting to create as we delve into this model demonstration of intensifying literacy instruction and the use of database individualization. But unlike tier 2, we would say would be like standard treatment protocol. For many of my colleagues in schools who are using pre-published intervention curriculum resources, you're in essence following those components of the intervention as designed. That would be standard treatment protocol. You're doing it with the specified dosage, the days, duration, et cetera, following the instructional procedures. But when we get to this highest level of intensive instruction, we're making adaptations right out the gate in some cases based on what's being selected. Things are being added because of the student's data. So our fidelity becomes to the plan, what these adaptations and the way in which we are delivering the instruction. It's no longer standard treatment protocol, follow the program as designed. So the dimensions that we hone in on, these dimensions of intervention intensity, when we think about essential practice 4, adaptations, are alignment, dosage, comprehensiveness, attention to transfer, and behavior supports. So we've provided you with an example of each of these dimensions and how the intervention instruction could be adapted. So alignment adaptations. So the teacher determines the way the current intervention matches the student's needs. So based on the analysis of student data, an alignment adaptation could be, you're going to supplement the current intervention. So you perhaps are going to add an additional strategy, practice, or intervention curriculum resource. You could also modify the existing intervention to better align with the needs as indicated by the student's data. So that's an example of alignment. So I had the gift of providing intensive intervention to a 4th grader from August right up until winter break. And I was working with a 4th grader who was his primary skill need was around decoding. And we started the summer or August, in the summer, we're working on basic decoding skills. And we got all the way up to advanced decoding. And the particular curriculum resource I was using was focused on decoding of multi-syllable words. And one of the components of the intervention program that I used, there were 25 lessons. And over the course of the lessons, certain components of the intervention faded. And at lesson 1 through 15, there was a component of the intervention. It was an activity F, and it was an oral activity where students were correcting close approximations of words using context. So for example, I would orally provide a word to the student, and I would intentionally pronounce it in a way that was phonetically correct, but it wasn't set, it needed to be adjusted, the pronunciation, based on what the word really was. So for example, the word was generosity, but I was pronouncing it. I was saying, make these words into real words. Listen as I read the word, generosity. And so generosity. And I would say, change the word to make sense in this sentence. Because of Mrs. Swenson's generosity, the library will be able to purchase many new books. What should the word be? And the word was generosity. Now, I will tell you that Zach and every other student I've used this intervention program with love this activity, love this oral activity. However, when this activity faded in lesson 15, we were now reading passages. And when Zach was reading the passages, he was forgetting to adjust the pronunciation of the word. He would read it and he needed to think about what word is in my lexicon that matches this word. So he had forgotten the purpose of this activity. Now, part of that could have been an instructional issue, an instructor issue. I wasn't explicit enough about the benefit of doing this. So what I had to do, an adaptation I needed to make with Zach, was I pulled back in this component of the intervention. So even though it was already faded, I pulled it back in, but I pulled it back in and I used some of the words in the passage that he was going to be reading. I predicted the words that he would not adjust the pronunciation of, even given the context. And so I did the oral activity with 3 of those actual words and use the sentences in which they appeared in the passage as a way to prime his pump for when he got to this passage. He might be able to see, oh, this is a strategy that is really, I think, is fun, but I see why it's helpful in the context of what I'm reading. So that is an example of an alignment adaptation where even though something in the intervention component had been faded, I knew that it was still in need. I brought it back in for a lesson or two and applied it to the context of the passages he would be reading because he needed additional practice. So this is one example. If we think about dosage adaptations, there's two types of dosage adaptations that we can consider. We can look at lesson design dosage adaptations and some structural dosage adaptations. So lesson design dosage adaptations would be the teacher creating the conditions to increase the number of practice opportunities for students in the intervention instruction. So this does start to blend into those elements of explicit instruction or comprehensiveness. So for example, the teacher could tighten up some of the student active participation procedures that are used. So making sure there's adequate think time, waiting 3 seconds, include more partner responses with the student who needs more practice opportunity. The student is really honing in the monitoring of the student that's in the partnership to monitor the response, to be there to be able to help provide the affirmative, corrective, informative feedback. The teacher could also reduce the amount of teacher talk to make space for more practice opportunities. So these are some examples of lesson design dosage adaptations. Some of the structural dosage adaptations could be things like increasing the number of intervention sessions or the number of instructional minutes, reducing the number of students who are participating, or increasing the ratio of adults to students. Now, I will tell you that in a lot of the districts and schools that I've worked with, some people jump right to reduce the group size, lower the group size, do smaller group. But what I oftentimes see, though, is that it doesn't mean that the instruction has changed. So if we just do a structural dosage adaptation of reducing the group size, but we're not being mindful about whether or not the instruction is best aligned with the skills and that we're increasing the practice opportunities, then this might not really work. And so it's something that we have to be very, very mindful of. Sharon, it looks like you were going to chime in. What would you add?
One thing I want to say about dosage. There's a difference between mass practice and distributed practice. Mass practice means that the student has a chance to practice the same word reading skill, phonics skill, vocabulary, text reading skill over multiple times within a session. Distributed practice means that you return to previously taught practices frequently and you distribute the practice over time. Learning theory very much supports distributed practice as a more effective procedure. And therefore, as you think about dosage, I encourage you to think about ways to distribute that practice and return to that practice to ensure learning is both acquired and retained.
Well, that was a good segue into comprehensiveness. You channeled our colleague, Anita Archer, who I know I happened to be on a call with, and we were talking about practice and how to structure different cumulative distributed practice. So yes, that was a perfect segue. So when we think about comprehensiveness adaptations, these are the elements of explicit instruction. And I did include, I know we have some of our Ohio colleagues on here, my colleague Beth Hess and some others. This should look familiar. I know Anita has been doing a significant amount of work with comprehensive state literacy development grantees. And so when we think about ways to adjust the intervention instruction to address comprehensiveness, we could think about using clear, more concise instructional language, providing an additional model. Notice I said an additional model. It's not Like, don't continue to model. We want to make sure kids are getting practice, and we have to be careful about the practice, which you see judicious practice on Anita's kind of one-page cheat sheet of elements of explicit instruction outlined here. We also we could improve the gradual fading of the instructional support and provide sufficient independent practice and cumulative review. So these are some examples of comprehensiveness adaptations. The attention to transfer or generalization, some of those adaptations based on the student's data could be the teacher incorporates words or texts that are being used from the students' classes into the intervention lesson itself. So the students have an opportunity to practice what they're learning in intervention to the context of their specific classroom materials. The student's classroom teacher could also provide, who are provided information about the intervention strategies or activities that students are learning. They also can encourage the use of these things in the context of class-wide instruction. They know how it should be used. They know how to prompt students to use it. So I've even seen teachers be consistent with the language. They try to match some of the prompting language that the interventionist uses with the students in the classroom setting. And this is giving students an opportunity to use the intervention, what they're learning in intervention, in the context of their classroom setting outside of the intervention class and time. I've worked with a number of students in intervention, and some of my colleagues who are on the phone have as well. Sometimes students really only think the only time they can use what they learned in intervention is during the intervention instruction. And so if we don't intentionally prompt the generalization or prompt students to transfer what they're learning, it may not happen. So it's something to be very mindful of. Last but not least, it has to do with behavioral support adaptations. So additional behavioral supports can be incorporated into the intervention instruction to increase students' overall motivation, their level of engagement, and ultimately their success. So there are some types of adaptations that we have further elaborated on pages 22 and 23 of the Intensifying Guide. Things like adjusting the organization and the physical environment of the classroom, include strategies to help students persist in completing the intervention components and activities, ways to incorporate students to monitor their engagement in the instruction, and ways to reduce off-task behavior. Sharon, what would you add about some of these adaptations?
One of the great things about teaching is that we are professional customizers. And so what I think that these organizational structures do is give us pathways for doing that. So rather than just kind of randomly selecting from my own repertoire or toolbox, I now have an organizational structure to guide my decision making.
Absolutely. So with that said, we have our final chat for our time together. What do you see as the benefits in using this process that we described? So using these dimensions of intervention intensity to help guide teachers' adaptations to the intervention instruction. What might be the benefit of doing this? Your last chat, you were talking about applying them from a review and evaluation of intervention. This one, we're talking about it from the lens of using these dimensions to adapt and intensify. So I'm hearing Erin saying it provides flexibility for individual students. Yeah. So now when I click on the chat, Sharon, I don't know if I'm going to get you asking questions or answering questions or.
No, right? Oh, I'm kind of a menace.
We have Melissa saying it provides intentionality to the adaptations rather than a random approach. Beth, the process supports the essential alignment among the three tiers. Yeah, so absolutely. Tara provides a framework that we can use for fidelity with the flexibility to meet individual needs. I love the fact that, Erin, that you said, or Tara, that you said it provides a framework, because I really see these dimensions as guiding some thinking and conversation and how we're looking at data to adapt the instruction. Excellent. Okay, so now, Sharon, this was your quote that is in the introduction of this guide. So I want to leave it to you to round out this portion of our time together.
Yeah, I consider learning to read the ultimate green card, our freedom finder. And, you know, if we ever want to punish anyone, what we do is we don't allow them opportunities to learn to read. You can look at it culturally, you can look at it historically. So Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you will be forever free, because there was a time in which we did not allow slaves to learn to read. Reading provides the ultimate pathway to opportunity, whether it's an opportunity to enjoy, learn, share experience, or broaden horizons. Reading is the gift that allows all of these things to occur.
Yeah, very powerful quote. You're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. People are saying one of my favorite quotes. Love that quote. Yeah, absolutely. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we only have two minutes left, and we have been answering questions throughout. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. And what a gift to get to spend an hour with two of my favorite women this afternoon. So thank you for sharing. What a wonderful resource. I think if you have in our participants and audience, if you have continued questions for Sharon and Kim, I would say continue to put them in the chat, and we will do our best in the next couple of minutes to answer them. One question that did come in, Kim, was the resource that you shared from Anita Archer, the explicit instruction handout. Is that from the recent explicit instruction book, or is that from somewhere else? And if you happen to remember, if you'd let us know, we can.
Anita's not going to mind. I can send it to you so you guys can send it right out. It's an individual handout she's been using. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So it sounds like a couple of resources may come through us, but otherwise, and in the last minute or two, there's just some resources in the slides. If you can go through the next one that we want to show you. These are on various NCII resources. Many of these we've already shared with you, that either the links came from Amy or myself in the chat box. If you're interested in exploring more about the taxonomy, there's a number of resources on the NCII website to do so. There's the link there. You know, how do I explore the taxonomy? How do I learn more? And then the next slide really talks about the tools chart. So resources specifically on where do I find information about evaluating the strength of different academic intervention tools. There's tools charts that look at assessments, excuse me, academic and behavior. So if you're interested in looking at the tools charts on NCII, I suggest you take a good look at those. Also resources around dosage. So again, we kind of went through dimensions on the taxonomy today. So more resources there. Again, individualizing decisions resources. So links to those, and you're familiar probably with those because Kim talked about them today. Next slide really talks about intensifying literacy intervention. So we have a number of sample lessons really broken into skills. So those are all linked there, and user guides for how to use those lessons. There's also a number of videos that go through those lessons. So those are all linked on that previous slide. And then the next two slides are the home slides for the Michigan MTSS website, which has all of the resources from where Kim works, and then the Meadows Center website, which is where Sharon is. There's some great resources. These 10 key resources that come out of the Meadows Center are really some of my favorites ones we pass along. So this is an example of a couple of them. There are many, but the 10 key policies around reading intervention, there's really some great 10 key resources. So we really suggest that we get, that you take a look at those. So